Couple of tricks and tips to help you get the most out of your cupping, to set up and run through it flawlessly, and also hopefully to have a good time when you're doing it. One thing that I like to remind folks, especially if you're trying to come up with your dose and grind setting from scratch, is to remember that the SCA ratio recommendation is of water to coffee, not water to cup volume. What I mean by this is that when you add a little bit of ground coffee to any cup, it's going to displace the water slightly. So in a 200 milliliter volume glass, for example, if you have 11 grams of coffee in that glass, about 15 milliliters of water will no longer fit in that space. So your actual water volume is 185 milliliters. I recently published some research in Roast magazine with my colleagues Elise and Sandra, and our recommendation is to take a look at your grinder and make sure that your cupping grind is fine enough to meet the appropriate standards and to get a proper extraction ratio out of your cups. The cups should be at roughly 18% extraction by the 15-minute mark when you start to evaluate the sensory character of the coffee. In many cases, I've found that roasters are grinding on the slightly too coarse side. One thing that I like to remind folks when they're cupping is that context can pretty strongly affect your perception of quality, whether it's acidity, sweetness, or body, for example. And for that reason, I recommend changing up the order in which you evaluate your samples throughout the course of your cupping. Sometimes if a strong tasting coffee precedes a weaker one, it can affect your ability to perceive the nuance in that weaker coffee, for example. By changing the order and tasting the weak one first on your second pass, it will give you a better chance to evaluate it fairly and correctly. I would also say it's important to use discretion when you're evaluating coffees for the purpose of their cupping. And what I mean by this is that sometimes in a sample cupping, for example, you might have roast levels of varying degree when you're trying to evaluate the quality of the green. Being careful to try to look past those roast differences and evaluate the inherent sensory green characters can help you pass a fair evaluation. However, if you're in a production cupping, evaluating the level and type of roast is going to be really important and crucial to understanding the quality that you're seeking. In some cases, it's totally appropriate to know the coffees that you're cupping. In the case of a production cupping, for example, it might be advantageous to know which coffee is supposed to be the dark roast and which one is supposed to be the espresso roast. It'll help you understand what you're looking for in that coffee. However, in many cases, a blind cupping is preferable. In these cases, I use often a simple A, B, C type order to help quickly blind the coffees and keep order organized and efficient and easy to understand for everyone who's attending the cupping. However, in some cases, it's important to create a double blind system where no one knows exactly what the coffees are until that key is revealed at the end of the cupping. Or to help prevent bias, maybe I prefer the letter A over B, for example, for some unknown reason. In this case, using a 3-letter or 3-number coded system can help you to make a more complex coding system without introducing a lot of bias based on individual preferences. Sometimes if roast degree is a potential factor in differences in the flavor of a coffee in your cupping, it might be helpful to have a grind sheet available for cuppers to look at so they can evaluate the visual color of the coffees in question. Grind sheet can be set up like this using coffee ground from the purge or flush cup from the grinder, or simply an additional cup. This is a quick way to be able to cue into if a coffee might be out of spec, light, or dark. I like to recommend that people avoid strong tasting foods and drinks before they come to a cupping. Things like salt, fat, or spice often affect cuppers' ability to taste things accurately. I usually try to time my cuppings for the morning hours when I'm fresh and ready to go. I also like to have a little bit of drip coffee at the cupping with me. It helps me to reset my palate if I need to step away for a second. Sometimes water can be too strong of a palate cleanser and leave the next cup tasting very bitter and strong as a contextual clue that might not be totally accurate. The last thing I'd say is just to remember that cupping can be time consuming. It can take a long time to set up the cupping for water to reach a boil. You should expect to be tasting the coffee actively for probably at least 15 to 20 minutes, and that's after a long period of waiting for the coffee to cool down. So just be sure to plan for enough time to not rush yourself through some important quality steps that you'll need to take time to do.